Hi, everyone. We'll give everyone some time to filter in today, and we'll start here in a little bit. All right, I see several participants joining, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Katie McCory. I'm a program manager with the National Safety Council Work to Zero initiative. Thank you all for joining our webinar today, Examining Trends in Technology Solutions in the Workplace. We'll go ahead and get started by providing an overview of what we will be covering today. I'll start by introducing our presenter and providing a little bit of information about the Work to Zero initiative here in a moment. From there, we'll dive into the content of our webinar, covering background info, an overview and results of the Work to Zero Safety Technology 2024 survey. And then we'll round out our presentation with some insights into the future direction of safety tech and implementation in the workplace. At the end of our presentation, we'll hold a Q&A session, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature to submit questions as we go along. Kate Crawford will be our presenter for today's webinar. Kate is the Senior Research Manager of Workplace Programs in the National Safety Council. With the National Safety Council. She has an MS in industrial hygiene and a PhD in occupational and environmental health. Kate joined the council with the Work to Zero initiative in 2022, where her research focuses on ways to integrate safety technology into the workplace to address fatal occupational injuries. Before turning it over to Kate, I wanted to take a moment to give you a little information about Work to Zero. I think it's important for us to first understand the major issue for which the initiative was established. This slide illustrates some of the stats and trends related to fatal workplace injuries. We know that non-fatal injuries have significantly decreased over time, but fatalities in the workplace have remained relatively stagnant, with over 5,000 workers dying on the job each year. This equates to approximately one worker dying every 96 minutes. Kate will be talking more about these trends throughout her presentation today. The Work to Zero initiative was established with support from the McElhatton Foundation with the goal to eliminate workplace fatalities by the year 2050 through the adoption of emerging tech. And as illustrated in the series of pictures you see here on the screen, we've come a long way with workplace safety. We know that safety technology exists today that can be used to mitigate or even eliminate workplace hazards altogether. We are already using many of these life-saving technologies in our personal lives. However, safety technologies in the workplace have not been widely adopted. This is the future of work, and Work to Zero aims to conduct research and develop free resources for employers to help make innovation more accessible and successful. All of our resources, to include a variety of tools, papers, reports, case studies, recorded webinars, and additional info, can be found on our website at nsc.org/work-to-zero. With that, I will now hand it over to Kate to dive into the content of our webinar today.
Great, thanks, Katie. So I'm going to start with some background information on the research that Work to Zero has done and how it really lays the foundation for the survey data that I'm really going to be focusing on today. So we go to the next slide. I wanted to talk about some of our initial research. So in 2019, when the initiative began, we had some fundamental research questions. The first of which was really, what are the most hazardous situations with the greatest potential for fatalities? So we were really trying to understand this burden, figure out where we could make the most impact, where we needed to focus. So NSC researchers reviewed data from the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries, or CFOI data, and we used BLS characteristic types, so things like worker activities, events or exposures, primary and secondary sources, to really try and contextualize workplace fatalities within hazardous situations. So rather than looking at fatalities by industry or by event or exposure, which is what we see more kind of typically depicted in statistical representations, we use this other method to really focus on situations that could be applied across industries. So situations like working at height, things that we see across industries in a variety of workplaces, and identify those risks with the greatest potential for serious injuries and fatalities. And so then we categorize these into 18 different hazardous situations, again, relevant across industries and worker activities. So this next slide will show you what we saw. Now, I do want to point out these are non-roadway fatalities. So those of you familiar with NSC know that we have a very strong research initiative dedicated to roadway safety. So we weren't looking at transportation fatalities, which we know is one of the leading causes of occupational fatal injuries. But if we kind of remove those from this analysis, this is what we started seeing. So 23% of those fatal occupational injuries were occurring during these work at height situations. Workplace violence accounted for 13%. Repair and maintenance tasks, we saw 12% of occupational fatalities occurring within those. So if we go to the next slide, the next part of this was to supplement that BLS data, that CFOI data. We also interviewed EHS professionals from different industries. So construction, oil and gas, utilities, manufacturing, not limited to those, but to give you an idea. And we asked them to provide these top hazardous situations and the associated risks that they were seeing within their facilities. So within these situations, we know that there's specific risks that lead to fatalities. We refer to those as situational risks. So for example, with that work at height situation I mentioned, falls to lower levels, being struck by falling objects, those are things that occur within that situation. So we also asked about systemic or contributing factors. So that's our next research question. So what is contributing to these fatality risks? And the next slide shows you that the top 3 contributors that we found were lack of training, fatigue, and lack of workplace awareness. You can think of lack of workplace awareness as being unfamiliar with the job site or your surroundings, maybe not paying attention to what's happening around you, things like that. The next slide, really our third question and one of the kind of fundamental pieces that drives the Work to Zero research agenda was to really understand what technologies are available that can eliminate or mitigate those risks. So the next slide, NSC partnered with Verdantix. Verdantix is a research and advisory firm with research coverage dedicated to EHS technologies. And this part of the work, NSC really looked at identifying, they found over more than 100 relevant safety technologies that were on the market, things that could be used to mitigate these situational and systemic risks that we just kind of highlighted. They were grouped into these different categories. Again, with those interviews, we asked EH&S professionals, what are kind of the top technologies that you see as relevant to being able to address your risks? And so this slide is showing the different technologies that we really focused on. These were kind of the heavy hitters when they were responding to what people are using, what's the most effective at mitigating risks. So we see things like digital gas monitors, which have certainly been around for a long time, but have done a lot to save lives when we think about going into confined spaces. Drones, anything to keep somebody's feet on the ground, you know, can we eliminate some of those risks associated with work at height? I've also seen really interesting use cases with drones into confined spaces or even into situations where you may be protecting workers from thermal stress. Lone worker monitoring, virtual and augmented reality. So these are the different techs that we've been looking into, and Work to Zero has a lot of resources on these if you're interested into digging into any more of these. So if we go to the next slide, wanted to stop for a moment and do a quick poll. So interested who's in the room, if you're currently using safety technology, are you thinking about using technology? Katie has this launched. We'll give you a moment to fill that out. And Katie, I'll ask you to share those results when it looks like we have some responses. All right, very cool. So interesting. So more than half of our audience is currently using safety technology. Another 15% are looking into it. And then about a third of folks aren't using anything right now, maybe aren't thinking about it. So I think this is exciting. It's nice to know who's in the room. We really try to provide content that's relevant to people in all these different areas, whether you're using it, thinking about it, or you're not using it. So that's great. Thanks, Katie. So if we go to the next slide, this is something we were going to try to do. Since so many of you are using tech or thinking about tech, we'd love for you to tell us what kind it is. So there's a QR code in the top of this slide you can scan, or I think Katie's also going to put a link to this in the chat. This will take you to a poll word cloud site. It might ask you for your name at the beginning, but just hit continue. We don't need to have names associated with this. It's perfectly fine to be anonymous. We're just curious what kind of text everybody's using. VR, wearables, okay. Wearables. Oh, here we go. Cool. So lone, looks like lone worker monitoring, gas monitors, Blackline, okay. Apps, yep, absolutely. Noise technology. Looks like maybe some fleet telematics in there. Very cool. Artificial intelligence. Looks like some of these, they maybe broke up some of the words. That's interesting. This is really cool. Okay. So really a variety of safety tech. That's awesome. It's really interesting to hear about. We're going to talk about some of the trends that we've seen with safety technology today further in the webinar. So we'll give this just another moment. Cobots. Cool. Yeah, software. It looks like gas monitors, maybe any kind of, and lone worker monitors, wearables, certainly some of the um, more popular ones. Drones, absolutely. Okay, cool. Well, we appreciate you filling that out. If you're still putting stuff in, you can keep doing that. I'm not sure if it shows on your end as well, but we'll um, take a screenshot of this and share it out with the webinar information if anyone's interested. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so what I want to do is start talking about these surveys. So Katie, you can go forward one more. So after that initial work that I just went through, our Safety 2020 paper that was looking at those situations, identifying that tech, mapping that tech to those situations, one of the next projects that Work to Zero did was to create a survey in 2020 of employers and employees in these high-risk industries. And the goal of the survey was really to understand awareness, attitudes, and uses of safety technology. And so we built that survey using those top hazardous situations that we talked about earlier, the situational risks that were identified, the priority technologies that were identified that we just talked about in that paper. And then we used the survey to collect data on the employer and employee top concerns their most likely exposures and the top contributors to injuries in the workplace. So we sent that out. It was 500 employers and 1,000 employees. This was deployed in April of 2020 across these 7 different industries. So the next slide. In 2023, we redeployed this 2020 survey. And so our objectives were, again, to understand workplace hazards that the employers and employees perceive as likely exposures and contributors to industries, what technology solutions were currently being used to address those hazards. We wanted to understand both barriers and motivators to implementing safety tech. And then since we're redeploying the survey for this 2023 version, a big part of this was also looking at kind of the changes and trends we've seen since 2020. So the next slide. Overall, minimal revisions were made to the survey between waves so we could ensure valid comparisons. I will say there was a couple of things that we added. So some new risks, thermal stress was something that was added. And then concerns, we added data privacy to the concern list. There was also some technology we added, location geofencing. And so those things were added because in the past 3 years that Work to Zero has been around and talking to industry professionals such as yourselves, we really identified those as emerging priorities that we needed to start incorporating. So a couple of additions, but for the most part, kept the survey the same. And you can see both the employees and the employer sides. So no significant differences between waves for job role, ethnicity, gender, region, company size. We did see some differences kind of in the industries we were reaching. So a little less in manufacturing, excuse me, a little bit more in manufacturing and retail compared to utilities and agriculture, which went down on the employee side. And you can kind of see some similar things happening on the employer side. So nothing that looked like it was going to be confounding to any significant degree, but certainly some limitations with a slightly different sample. So the next slide, we'll get into some of the results, which I'm sure is why you're here and what you're really interested in. I'm going to break these up so we can kind of go through them a piece at a time. I'm going to start with these likely exposures and contributors to industry injuries. So we'll go to the next one. So when we're talking about likely exposures, what we did in the survey was we asked employees how likely they were to be exposed to different hazardous situations in their jobs. And then similarly, for the employer survey, we asked them how likely their employees would be exposed to those situations. And so as you can see from this table, across the board, perceptions of exposures have increased between waves for both groups. The increases in employees reporting likely exposures were significant for most risks. And they were more similar to employer responses than in wave 1. So in the 2020 version, we saw bigger differences between the groups and what they considered likely exposures. In wave 2, not only have things increased across the board, but we're seeing kind of more agreement between the two groups. The most notable differences, I think, to point out between employer and employee perceptions were related to the lack of workplace awareness and work at heights. So both of which employers perceived as more likely exposures than employees. Also wanted to point out workplace violence here. So that's still perceived as the lowest exposure risk for both groups. However, the perceived likelihood of exposure to workplace violence has significantly increased since 2020, with at least a third of both groups considering it a likely exposure. The next slide is a visual. So this illustrates how the responses regarding likelihood of exposure and top contributors to injuries compare to each other. Now, this is the employer data only. So again, we asked how likely will your employees be exposed? So that's over on the y-axis. And then we asked what situations and contributing risks contributed to injuries in the last year. So asked employers at their job site, what were the things that led to actual injuries at your site? And that's on the x-axis here. And so a couple things just to get started before I dig into this. This does not take into account severity of injury, does not take into account concern. But I think this is an interesting visual because it kind of gives us a way to potentially help how we look at and understand these risks. So if we start looking at these quadrants, can we make the most impact if we're looking at this top right, where we know we're seeing high likely exposures, but we're also seeing a lot of injuries coming out of those things that are up there. So these risks, the thermal stress, heavy equipment operation, work at heights, fatigue is way up there. So like across the board, fatigue was one of the most common things that people said they would be exposed to, about 80%. And then it was also one of the top contributors to injuries. So kind of in contrast to that, if we look at the top left, here's where we're seeing what's considered high exposure but low injuries. So these repair and maintenance tasks. That's interesting to me because I think what that's saying to us is they say, our people are doing repair and maintenance tasks all the time, but we're not seeing a lot of injuries from that. So is it perhaps that we're controlling those hazards very well? Is that something we need to like really look at how we're approaching it and see if there's things we can learn from that? And then, jumping down to the bottom right, so low exposure, high injuries. So I think this is another really interesting quadrant in my mind. Here we're saying we're not likely to be exposed to it, but we are seeing it contribute to a lot of injuries. So does that mean, our people are usually get the right training? If there's any instance where they're doing something where they haven't been trained properly, it ends badly. So that's something we really need to focus on, make sure training's okay. I also will say there's some potential for some bias here, perhaps. So one of the things that we kind of asked about in the survey was in general a lot about training. And we do see some gaps between employers and employees when it comes to training, having enough of it. Employees were saying, I don't get trained as often as employers saying they were getting trained. So I think there's some things to dig into there. Similarly, lack of workplace awareness. I had said earlier, that's kind of being unfamiliar with a job site or surroundings or not paying attention to your environment. I think it's potentially likely that people are saying, no, I'm very aware of my workplace. But then if we start seeing these injuries, maybe people aren't quite as aware as they think they are. There's some really interesting work that the Campbell Institute has done regarding kind of visual literacy and how to recognize safety situations. And so I think there's opportunities to dig into that as well. So I think we can go to the next slide. Also wanted to talk about some of the concerns. So that four square I just showed, as I said, doesn't take into account concerns. Workplace violence was in that bottom left corner, so kind of low likelihood of exposure, weren't seeing a lot of injuries come from it. But if we go to the next slide, we see that it is one of the top concerns. So again, kind of across the board, concern over workplace violence is increasing. Significant increases in employers' level of concern between waves. So 66% said it was a concern for them, up from 57% in 2020. Another note about training, despite 66% being concerned about it, only 56% reported that they were providing training. And approximately 10% of employers said that it caused an injury. So again, potentially not one of the biggest exposures, but definitely a concern. And like I said, in terms of severity of outcome, Katie mentioned it at the beginning. We know from the fatality data, there was notable increases in homicides this past year. So certainly nothing in that bottom left-hand quadrant of that foursquare should be overlooked. And there's still a lot to dig into there. So the next slide has some kind of more general information regarding concerns. So across industries, really no significant differences in the concerns reported. But there were kind of a few notable trends that we saw. So employers in the construction industry reported notably higher concern of workplace fatalities than other industry responses. So about 81% of employers in construction were concerned, compared to kind of a range between 60 and 75% in other industries. And so certainly this may be due to the higher number of likely exposures and workplace risks that we know we see in construction, as well as the continually high fatality rates within this occupational group. So year to year, construction is one of the hardest hit with fatal injuries. Transportation and warehousing employers reported notably higher concern for employee illness, so 94%. Data privacy, and workplace violence. And again, I think some of these trends we can kind of understand. Maybe it's not surprising. We know transportation and warehousing were particularly hard hit with the COVID pandemic. Data privacy, I think, is interesting, especially with transportation and warehousing. We know there's more opportunities there for some of the wearable technologies, some of the lone worker monitoring, any kinds of tracking technologies we tend to see use in these industries. And workplace violence, again, transportation, another big one for workplace violence. Agriculture reported higher concerns for lack of proper training and substance use than other industries. I think that one's interesting. I have somewhat of an ag background and lack of training when we think about the different sizes of these operations, kind of where workers are coming from, kind of the changing workforce, if there's access to training, things like that. So I think that's really interesting. And then I have retail on here too, where we saw concerns with fatigue, lack of training, and technology automation higher than other areas. So also some interesting insights based on industry. And the technology automation, perhaps that's a segue if we go into the next slide. I think this is where we're going to start talking about what we saw in some of the technology use and things that we got in the survey. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about barriers to adoption, which is something we really tried to focus in on. So if you want to go to the next slide. Take some time to explain this. So survey participants were asked to identify technologies that they believed were relevant to their organizations. So that is this applicability line up at top. So is it something, technology that you see along the bottom here, along the x-axis? These are these different types of technologies that we asked about. So this is showing risk management software is this first one here on the left. And so 92% of employers said, yes, this is something that would be applicable to my worksite. We also asked if they were considering using it. And so that's our consideration line. So these kind of this next row that we see consideration in the lighter green. So again, looking at risk management software, this means that 92% of employers said, yes, this is applicable to what we're doing. 82% they were considering it. So a lot of high consideration for that particular software. And then of course, this last one, use, I think you know where I'm going with this. We asked employers what they were using. If they were testing something out, piloting it, using it, any of that counted. And so that was captured here. So again, looking at risk management software, about 38% said, yes, we are using risk management software. I really like this illustration. I think we can kind of consider this as like a technology landscape, right? And we really start seeing the gaps between these different stages. So I've highlighted some of the biggest gaps. So between those who said it was applicable to those that they're considering it, aggressive behavior detection, 87% said that's something that would be applicable to what we're doing. Only 54% of employers were even considering it. So a pretty big gap there compared to some of the other ones that we're seeing. And then these other ones show gaps between the consideration and use. So for worker impairment detection, 66% of employers said they were considering it. Only 19% are using it. AR and VR, we have some users in the group today. What we saw on the survey, the general survey data, we had 66% of people considering it and only about 17 using it. So I think this is something we're especially interested in at Work to Zero when we start looking at how can we start closing some of these gaps? What is it, that keeps people who are considering it from using it? So if we'll go to the next slide, and we can also start looking at differences between waves, survey waves. So here, the darker colors are the more recent 2023 data, and the lighter are the older 2020 data. Now I'm going to add lines to this chart, but they are for visualization only. So Katie, if you want to click through one more time. So I just have to add the disclaimer. So across the bottom, we have technology data. These are categorical. These are not associated in any way. So please don't let the lines confuse you, but I think it's much easier to kind of see these trends if we put the lines in. So bear with me on that. So now what you're seeing is kind of the lighter lines on the bottom of these applicability waves. Consideration, we see the lighter line, the 2020 data. And so what that's showing us is there's increases in those things in the last 3 years. So for both of those things, we see more employers responding to them. So across technologies, all the ones we asked about, more employers said, yes, this is applicable to what I'm doing. Again, across technologies, more employers said we're considering these things. So we are seeing increases in those areas. As you can see from these bottom two lines with the using, the darker red is the 2023, the lighter red is the 2020, and there we're really not seeing much. Those are very similar, not seeing a big change in use. So really, I think kind of across the board, we're thinking this is increased awareness. People understand more about the technologies that are out there, how they can be used to address specific hazards. More people are considering using them, but really not using a lot of them. So that's kind of where we're ready to focus is this. I think the difference between this consideration line and this use line, we think of this as like an implementation barrier. So if an employer believes that a tech is relevant to their workplace hazard, they're thinking about using it, then it's really critical to understand the reasons that they're not moving forward with adoption and trying it out. And so another thing that the survey was designed to do was to collect responses, identifying the barriers to tech adoption. So maybe we can start digging into this. So let's take another poll. If you go to the next slide, Katie, I think we've got a question on here. Yeah, absolutely. So just interested about your barriers. So those of you who are using tech or considering using it, and those of you who aren't using tech, what are the kind of things that are stopping you? These responses We're just asking you to pick one because I think we've done this in the past and everybody kind of says it's actually probably all of these things. And we understand that, but just curious if you can think about what's your biggest challenge. Is it your ability to identify the right technology? Is it difficulty in building the business case for technology? Cybersecurity concerns, organizational mindset, or employee buy-in? So I'll give you a moment, another moment to look into that. Okay, great. So looks like kind of a tie for the top two would be ability to identify the right tech, and then organizational mindset and readiness. Absolutely 17% difficulty building the business case. Nobody's worried about, well, top concern is not data privacy, I'll say that much. So that's interesting. Employee buy-in, certainly haven't thought about it. Yeah, all really interesting. Appreciate you sharing that. We'll talk, I'll show you what we were seeing in our survey. I also mentioned some resources that we have. So Katie, if you want to go to the next slide. So this is what we're seeing in terms of kind of the barriers reported by the employers that we surveyed. This picture, again, this is really trying to focus on comparisons between 2020 and 2023. And so we see a marked decrease in a lot of these barriers. So things like purchase cost, that was a pretty substantial barrier, still certainly a substantial barrier, but has gone down. I think it's interesting from that poll that that's no longer the number one, based on even just who's in the room right now. Employee compliance, employee distrust, those things have decreased as well. Lack of time to test tech or implement training policies, still seeing some decreases there. Also, some of the other barriers that were reported included concerns over collecting personal information that may violate employee privacy. So in the poll, we asked about data privacy concerns. That's something that's been coming up. I think kind of interestingly enough, about half of employers said they were concerned about that. But then employees, only 40% said that that was their top concern, which I just thought was interesting. So it could be an issue of employers are like more concerned about how they can protect that data, what they do with that data. Just some more things to worry about than just having it be collected. So something I thought was interesting. And so if we go to the next slide, I also wanted to mention this. So we surveyed employees about their barriers to using more traditional safety equipment and personal protective equipment, as well as safety technologies. And so the main obstacle for using PPE in the workplace is comfort. About 42% of employees said that's the number one issue with wearing PPE. So why people aren't wearing it, why they don't like to wear it. But then if you look at these others, you know, it interferes with my work, it obstructs my vision or movement, fit. We know that's just a continuous issue for PPE in the workplace, especially when we have a diverse workforce. Aging equipment, lack of training, supply, all these things. And I just want to point this out because a lot of these barriers, if not all of them, translate to barriers for safety technology as well, especially for any wearable technologies. So when we did the poll earlier, we saw wearables was pretty big in the word cloud, meaning a lot of you were using wearables. So things like vital signs monitors or lone worker monitoring devices, extended reality devices, headsets, exoskeletons, all those things. These are the barriers that apply for those as well. So I know certainly that's really something we need to continue to address, something we need to continue to work with solution providers to keep kind of addressing when they're developing these products. So let's go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about future directions, kind of what we see Work to Zero, what we're going to be focusing on in the next 3 years, what some of the research gaps still are. So the next slide, one of the ways that we use these survey data was to really try and better understand where participants are in their technology adoption journey. And so we really see folks that kind of fall into these 3 stages. So pre-contemplation, people, they're not thinking seriously about changing. They're not interested in implementing technology now. Maybe it's just not on their radar, haven't thought about it. I think we saw, again, maybe some similar numbers in the polls. We have people in here who aren't using tech, maybe just aren't thinking about it right now. Some of the barriers that we see there is either, it's a lack of knowledge or resources. They're just not ready to do it, maybe need more information. And then the kind of next stage we see is this consideration preparing stage, where we saw over half of our participants, so 54%. And I will say that's an increase from 2020. So really just along the spectrum, we saw a shift towards the end. So we see more people who are innovating, more people who are considering, less people in that pre-contemplation stage. But in this kind of preparation stage, these folks, we kind of consider them late adopters. So they're interested in technology, they're looking into it. They're really looking for evidence of success. So this is a group that kind of is looking for case studies. They want to know how similar organizations, similar industries are implementing tech. They want to know how it went for them and kind of what they learned from it. They're also looking for very practical tools for implementation. So what can I use to help me through this process? And then, of course, on this third group, this 23% kind of on the right side, these are our innovators. These are folks that are using tech. Really what they're focusing on is continuous improvement, figuring out how it can be used maybe throughout the organization, or in broader context, or maybe even they're starting to adopt more technology. The next slide. So if you're familiar with Work to Zero, I'm sure you're familiar with our safety innovation journey. But this is the safety innovation journey kind of encompasses all of our resources and our strategies for adopting technology. So if you're not familiar with it yet, this is kind of how we organize the steps to this, and as well as our resources. So the first thing is assessing your risk, understanding the kind of hazards that you're solving for, identifying tech solutions. So again, like I said, what technologies are out there that can be used to address those risks? So if we think back to that tech landscape graph, this is where we really try and help people understand which technologies are applicable to their specific hazards. So what can they use? And maybe it's something that they didn't even realize would work in that way. Digital readiness. So that was a barrier that we saw from the poll, right? A lot of people said it's just the organizational mindset, readiness. We're just not ready to do it. We try to create resources that really focus on how do you prepare for this? What kind of questions do you ask? How do you engage all your stakeholders? How do you engage your workforce? How do you engage your partners? What kind of questions do you need to ask your solution providers to make sure that you're ready to kind of adopt this? Making the business case, that return on investment, understanding what some of these potentially substantial investments will look like further down the road if you're using them to solve for injuries and safety. And then our pilot and implementation roadmap, this kind of last step is like really when you're ready You've gone through all these other stages. You're ready to get going. What are kind of the specific steps you need to do, and how can you continue that continuous improvement process? What kind of things can you implement to make sure you're evaluating how it's going, understanding what you need to do next, things like that. And so we're really working, like I said, working this year to try and use this data certainly as the foundation, and doing our other projects to really kind of build these out and continue to create resources within these different steps. And so the next slide, I think, shows some of the specific things we're looking at in these upcoming years. So really trying to focus on some practical tools and resources for each of those steps we just looked at. Absolutely want to continue to do case studies. So those who are considering and preparing, as I said earlier, we know what kind of resources they're interested in. We love doing case studies and learning from these early adopters, kind of the thought leaders in safety who are using this tech, who've learned from it. It's also really helped sharing stories about what didn't work. I think that's an important part. And I think sometimes people aren't always like the first to share that information, but absolutely a critical step in this. Also looking to do some more pilot studies. So these are opportunities to follow a workplace and really help employers evaluate technology pre and post implementation. See what's working throughout the entire process. What are the ways that we're engaging people throughout, which ties in very much to this kind of human-centered piece that's listed here at the bottom too. How do we get people involved at every step of this process? The survey data showed that 83% of employees agreed that they were open to trying and using new safety tech in the workplace, which I think is really promising. We know that the workforce is kind of ready for this. And these aren't just your end users. These are your workplace experts. These are the folks that know the work better than anyone. They're the ones who understand if and how technology can be used to solve for some of these issues. So it's absolutely critical to engage them along the way. So I think we'll go to the next slide. This is the QR code that will get you to the report. So if you're interested in the things that we've talked about today, you want some more details, you want to dig into this a little more, I encourage you to download our report. This is available for free on our website now. And you can get that. And I think there may also be a link in the chat. Otherwise, the QR code works, or you can go to NSC Work to Zero on the resources tab and find that. And then I also wanted to highlight another resource that's coming out. So if we go to the next slide, we have a new paper coming out on vital signs monitoring and heat stress. You may remember from earlier slides that thermal stress and heat exposure is a major concern. It's also a highly likely exposure as reported. And we also know there's a lot happening with heat stress right now, OSHA's proposed rule. So really excited about this paper. It goes into heat mitigation strategies and then provides a tech overview kind of specific to vital signs monitoring and how they can be used to help mitigate heat stress. So some use cases, some highlights for some case studies that we have coming out on these technologies, benefits and considerations. And then we'll also have a webinar coming up August 14th. We don't have the registration link yet, but it is coming soon. So let us know if you're interested in that. And I think with that, Katie, I think we're ready for some questions if there's anything that's come in. And also wanted to make sure you have our contact information here. So if there's any questions or follow-up later, please reach out. We'd be happy to discuss further.